So now we're very excited, of course, to have our last guest with us. You've all stayed to the end to hear him. We've been trying for 6 years to get him into this room. And I'd like to invite Kirk Eckstein to the stage. Rick Eckstein, pardon me. Rick Eckstein is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Western Forest Products. Come on up and make the introduction, please.
I've been called a lot of things, but never Kirk. Good afternoon. I'm a businessman and I'm a lumberman, and over the past 35 years, I've bought and sold lumber on just about every continent. And that's earned me a great deal of experiences and a few adventures. But the single most important thing I've learned is that opportunities come and go, and the only certainty in global business is that nothing remains the same forever. And all of my experiences have led me to develop my own personal mantra of change or die. And I've learned that whether it's in my own business, in my relationships with my family, my children, or in politics, that mantra applies everywhere, every time, every day. A few weeks ago, I was elected chair of one of North America's largest lumber associations, and one of my responsibilities is to write a monthly column to members. And I get to name the column whatever I want. And I asked a good friend of mine, who was once a journalist and who many of you actually know, to help me come up with a name that would best reflect who I am. And Peter Kent, one of our great Conservative members of Parliament, thought for a moment and said, "For you, Rick, against the grain." I'm not sure if it's a compliment or not, but against the grain is an appropriate segue for our next speaker. Mark Steyn is an international best-selling author, a top 41 recording artist. I had to actually Google that to make sure if it was correct, but a top 41 recording artist and a human rights activist. He has a history of criticizing the institutional media when he believes they have bent over too far backwards in the name of political correctness. He wrote articles and maintained a blog for Maclean's covering the business fraud trial of his friend Conrad Black, and he was never convinced that Mr. Black had committed a crime. And he believes that Europe is almost totally dominated by Islam, and that this is a reality that cannot be reversed. In 2007, a complaint was filed with the Ontario Human Rights Commission related to an article he wrote for Maclean's titled "The Future Belongs to Islam." Mark Steyn is an individual who knows what he believes, and he's certainly not afraid to go against the grain. I read a lot of Mark's articles, and because of his vast knowledge of the Muslim world and the conservative world, I asked him last night if I could set him up with two, maybe a little bit uncomfortable topics this afternoon, and he agreed. So here's topic number one. A few weeks ago, I traveled with the Prime Minister as part of his delegation to the State of Israel and the Kingdom of Jordan. And in Jordan, I took one of our cabinet ministers and a couple of our MPs out to dine with a couple of my old customers who both happen to be Christians. And in that part of the world, it takes about 2 minutes for the conversation to turn to politics. And one of our MPs asked my friend, "So what do you see this region looking like in 30 years? And he expected a diatribe on Palestinian and Jews. And instead, my friend simply said, "There will be no Christians here anymore." He told us story after story of persecution of Christians in the Arab countries and said there are horror stories coming out of Syria of rebels, Muslim extremists, going into Christian villages, rounding up the inhabitants into the central squares and shooting them and burning them alive. I said, "Where's the world press on this?" And they didn't know. So the next day I recounted this story to some of our most senior elected officials, and they told me to believe the stories. So I talked to Mark about this last night, and I'd love to hear his comments about why the world isn't screaming. Topic number two is I heard a lot of facts that I didn't like this weekend. From Andre, I heard that people don't seem to call themselves as conservative as they once did, and that people think the Liberals can deal with the economy better than we can. And Andre noted that Canadians don't want to talk about marijuana, and yet every time I turn on my radio, I hear another paid ad by the Conservative Party suggesting that Mr. Trudeau is going to turn all our kids into marijuana addicts. And I heard that real conservative policies and real results are losing out to good hair. So as much as I enjoyed being at this conference, I didn't like a lot of what I heard about the state of the conservative movement. So Mr. Steyn, you're our last speaker. Please give all of us conservatives the facts of life. Are we in trouble? Is this the time to put up the big neon lights flashing change or die? Ladies and gentlemen, a strong conservative, a man who's not afraid to go against the grain, Mr. Mark Steyn.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rick. I will get to those topics. I've been scribbling furiously the last couple of days, hearing things in various breakout sessions that made me think and made me annoyed and made me want to push back a little on. So I'll do a bit of that too. But I'm glad to be back in Ottawa. I was born in the Wellesley Hospital in Toronto. They've torn it down now. They didn't want to take any chance of that happening again, so. And so people ask me what it's like being back home and back in Ottawa, and it's emotional for me. I feel like Michael Ignatieff in the book he wrote to promote his liberal leadership campaign, when he wrote those heartwarming words that I think meant so much to all of us, when he said that Canada is, quote, "the place on earth that if I needed one, I would call home," unquote. Thanks. Actually, I believe Michael's first draft said, "Canada is the place on earth that if I ever needed a home, would certainly be on the final short list of 5 or 6. But you know what these liberals are like. They focus grouped it to within an inch of its life, and so was the other version he came up with. I've had a great time these last couple of days. I was in an elevator late last night with 2 former ministers of the Crown singing "Sometimes When We Touch, the Honesty's Too Much" to each other. I won't say who they are. Well, I might in the Q&A. I mean, it's not like we're on CPAC or anything. And it reminds me, I think, that there are some things that Canada does better than America, and I think post-political life is one of them. I love that Senator Brazeau is now the day manager of the Bare Facts Club. You know, one minute you're in the Senate getting fawned on by the gentleman usher of the black rod, and the next you're the gentleman washer of the sparkly pole. It's like, it's brilliant. In Washington, on the rare occasions that senators cease being senators, they become big-time lobbyists, and more often they just stay there for 5, 6, 7 decades. Robert C. Byrd was a senator, I think until he was 112 or something like that. Everything, if you ever go to West Virginia, everything in West Virginia is named after him. You land at Robert C. Byrd International Airport, and you ask for directions, and they say, "Oh, just head straight down Robert C. Byrd Airport Parkway, turn left by the Robert C. Byrd Enterprise Park, take Robert C. Byrd Boulevard down past the Robert C. Byrd Mall to the Robert C. Byrd Gallery of West Virginia Art." And a few years ago, he turned sour on the war in Afghanistan, and I suggested to President Bush he might be able to retain Senator Byrd's support if he changed the name of Afghanistan to Robert C. Byrdistan. I would give anything to have seen Robert C. Byrd forced to take a job as the day manager of the Robert C. Byrd Fairfax Pussycat Lap Dancing Lounge. It was a great moment. So when people talk about Senate reform, we've had a lot of discussion about Senate reform the last couple of days. I can't be the only guy who thinks the least constitutionally problematic solution would just be to move all the senators into the Fairfax Club. There you go. We're halfway there. And you could have the. I don't see why you put the throne in front of the pole. I don't see why you can't have the throne speech there. You know, we've had a lot of attractive governors general over the years. Michaëlle Jean, if you recall, said in what I think was the most memorable soundbite of her term, at one point she said, "Let's face it, I'm totally hot." And by the way, if you're thinking, is she the first Governor General to say, "Let's face it, I'm totally hot"? No, the Marquis of Lansdowne did in the throne speech of 1887. You know, not a lot of people know that, but it comes up in Trivial Pursuit, so you might want to be. And it's a pleasure to be here with Preston. He was the indispensable man during the 1990s. Sometimes you don't get to the top of what Disraeli called the greasy pole. That's a political expression, by the way, nothing to do with the Senator Brazo's present employment. Sometimes you don't make the top of the greasy pole, but you're important, and you keep certain issues in play. And because you keep them in play, you persuade the guy in the governing parties that they have to move part of the way towards you to stop people nibbling off votes from the right. And Preston kept a lot of important issues in play, all during the time of the divided right of the 1990s. And he was the indispensable man in Canada in that period. I want to talk today about an expression that came from Mrs. Thatcher, and is a very simple one. The facts of life are conservative. The facts of life are conservative, and you can try and buck those facts of life, but reality will have a way of asserting itself. The first fact, I think, deals with what's going on in our neighbor to the south. Ross Dow, that many of you heard today, and he was asked why Republicans don't get together and connect more with Canadian conservatives and Australian conservatives and conservative parties around the rest of the English-speaking world. There's very few connections there. And he basically, I'm paraphrasing his answer, but he basically said, well, we don't think you guys are the real deal. We think you're like wussy conservative light, and the Republican Party is the real thing. And I've heard that a lot in the United States. I had a disagreement with Professor Paul Ray of Hillsdale College at the time Obama was ramming through Obamacare and the stimulus and all the rest of it. And I said that as a Canadian, this looked very familiar to me, a lot of what he was doing. And Professor Ray said to me, well, you don't get it. You don't get it. Americans are not Canadians. We are not going to go willingly into that dark statist night the way Canadians have been willing to do. Now, at that point, total government spending, just to go back to that video we were looking at, total government spending in the United States was 42% of GDP. And in Canada, at that time, it was 43% of GDP. So that tiny little sliver of 1% is the difference between Ross Dow, that's sturdy, self-reliant republic of manly small government types, and an effete, panty-waist, deadbeat, pansified, semi-French monarchical basket case. That little 1%. A year ago, when Professor Paul Ray and I had that argument, the percentages were actually this. Canada, 42-something%, we've gone down, and the United States, 45-something%. So sometimes a country's mythology outlives the reality. And I would humbly suggest to Ross and friends in the Republican Party that their mythology has outlived the reality of what has actually happened in the United States. If you take America's total indebtedness, federal, state, the lot, it averages out to $750,000 per family. The United States is on course to become the first nation of negative millionaires. But if you just stick with the official federal debt, the figure for which Washington is officially responsible, in Australia, each citizen's share of the debt is $12,000. In New Zealand, it's $15,000 per person. In Canada, $18,000. In the United Kingdom, $28,000. And in the United States, it's $54,000 per person. Twice as much as Britain, thrice as much as Canada, closing in on 5 times as much as Australia. And on that trajectory, America is exiting the first world. We've just had the federal budget in Ottawa. Last year, the deficit, I believe I'm right in saying, was $6 billion. And this year there will supposedly be a surplus of 18 billion. Those are rounding errors in a Washington budget. The US government spends $6 billion it doesn't have every 32 hours. What would that $18 billion surplus that Canada has this year, what would that buy you in Washington? It would buy you one half of one nothing little federal program. The Obama administration's $38.6 billion clean technology program was supposed to create or save 65,000 jobs. Half the money has been spent, that's 17.2 billion, and they have 3,545 jobs to show for it, which works out to an impressive $4,851,904.09 per green job they've created. That's the difference in scale between what is happening down south and what is happening up here. By the way, I love what people complain about here. I opened the National Post this morning and saw that Alison Redford is in trouble for spending $9,200 to fly herself, her daughter, and 2 staffers back from Palm Springs for Ralph Klein's funeral. That's $9,200, that's $4,800, that's $2,400 per person. For $9,200, you can't take Obama to the men's room at the Starbucks across from the White House. You can't take him there for $92,000. It costs $7 million to fly the Obamas to Hawaii for a week's Christmas vacation. And I love the way, and people should never stop. I love it, a world where people complain about $9,000 of political expenditures. When Prince William and his lovely bride were here a year or two ago, and they flew them to Los Angeles in that RCAF bone shaker that they call the VIP transport. And her Royal Highness emerged looking radiant, as she always does, but it was probably because the RCAF had decided to splash out on new bedding for the royal tour. Master Corporal Amanda Heron was dispatched to the local mall in Trenton and returned with a pale blue and white comforter and matching pillows. Is there no end to the grotesque indulgence of these pampered royal deadbeats? I found a beautiful set, said Master Corporal Heron. It was such a great price, I bought one for myself. Don't ever lose that, because in Washington, both parties are part of the problem. You know, in 2011, Obama's now entirely forgotten Deficit Commission produced a bipartisan report, melodramatically emblazoned the moment of truth, in which it proposed such convulsive course correction as raising the age of Social Security eligibility to 69 by the year 2075. You know, if that's the best America can do, there isn't going to be a 2075, not for anything recognizable as the United States. And this gets to our first fact of life. When money drains, power drains. When a nation loses control of its finances, it loses control of its destiny. And when the global superpower loses control of its finances, then you're in a situation where what we think of as the free world, protected by the United States since 1950, is also in danger of losing control of its destiny. Chuck Hagel has just made an announcement that the United States is going to downsize its military to pre-1940 levels. If you'd taken a train across North America in 1938 and you just looked at the men in uniform at the stations you stopped at, you would have thought Canada was the military superpower on the North American continent in 1938. So the idea of the United States military shrinking back to pre-1940 standards is quite a significant move. The US accounts for over 40% of the world's military expenditures. And the Congressional Budget Office has predicted that by the end of this decade, America will be spending more on debt interest than on its military. In other words, not paying off your MasterCard at the end of the month, but just paying or making the minimum interest payment necessary to roll over the debt till next month. The cost of that will be more than the entire budget for the US military, which means they will be spending more on debt interest than China, Britain, France, Russia, Japan, Germany, Saudi Arabia, India, Italy, South Korea, Brazil, Australia, Spain, Turkey, Israel, and Canada spend on their militaries combined. So within a few years, US debt interest payments will be covering the entire cost of the Chinese armed forces. If they ever have a military showdown over Taiwan, Washington will be funding both sides of it. That's how crazy it is. When money drains, power drains. And for Canada, the biggest geopolitical challenge will be to figure out a way not to get sucked down that same drain if America proves incapable of serious course correction. And by the way, just to pick up the point that Rick was making, that is why we are seeing the ongoing religious cleansing of the Middle East, why Christian churches are being burned down, and why Christians are fleeing the Middle East. The Christian community in Iraq disappeared on America's watch. The last Christian church was raised in Afghanistan, I think, in 2011, on America's watch, because those guys have figured out that in the end, you can be the biggest spender on the planet, but if you don't have the will to enforce your way, you can be provoked with impunity. If you're in Singapore or Australia or Poland or Israel, they'll tell you that the American moment, the post-Second World War order, is coming to an end. And they're making plans for the post-American world as best you can. If you're in Paris, they think that the 2-century Anglo-Saxon imperium from the British Empire to the American Republic, they see it like the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic as one continuous stream of history. They think that is now coming to an end. And in China, they think that a half-millennium perverse Anglo-European blip is coming to an end as the world returns to its natural Asian and more specifically Chinese domination. A year ago, I took my daughter to see Westminster Abbey, and we looked at the coronation chair, which features in like a big scene in the King's speech that she'd just seen. And it was commissioned by King Edward the Confessor in the year 1300 and has been used for every coronation since. And a chair that lasts 7 centuries is quite something. My daughter reminded me that when I treated myself to a self-assembly deluxe office chair from Office Depot and I self-assembled it, it de-self-assembled 72 hours later. So a chair that lasts 7 centuries is kind of impressive. You know, when that chair was built, the biggest cities in the world were Hangzhou, as we used to call it in China, and Nanking and Cairo in Egypt. And London was a muddy dump on a rain-sodden island off the edge of the map. And in 1215, when Magna Carta was signed in some nothing little meadow near Windsor Castle, the biggest cities were again Hangzhou and Constantinople and Merv in Turkmenistan. Anyone here from Merv today? Come on, give them a big hand, folks. Anyone? Nobody here from Merv? I can't believe that. I can't believe that. The Turkmenistan Merv was the most famous Merv in the world until Merv Griffin. In fact, I think they're the only 2 famous Mervs now I come to think about it. But once upon a time, Merv mattered, and then it didn't. And as the Turkmenistan Tourist Board would be the first to tell you, when you cease to be a part of the future, you also cease to be a part of the past because nobody cares anymore. Jason Kenney was talking yesterday about how our elites have a contempt for skilled labor. And so the presumption of how we raise our children is to divert more and more of them away from genuine primary wealth creation and say, well, why don't you just go to the University of Western Ontario and study transgender and colonialism studies for 6 years? If you swing by Carleton University and talk to a 7th-year human rights student, that's please. We have some in the house. I wish that were a joke, but it comes from a story in the Ottawa Citizen from last year. Students put up a so-called free speech wall to promote free speech, and it was destroyed a few hours later in, quote, an act of forceful resistance by 7th-year human rights student Aaron Smith. I don't know where Aaron Smith is. Maybe he's an 8th-year human rights student now. But you know, if you go to Carleton and you go up to a 9th-year, 13th-year human rights student, sitting on the grass on a summer's day, listening to the latest little dinky device from Apple about the size of a business card, let's not mock Aaron Smith too much. I'm sure it's very grueling trying to finish your thesis after a decade and a half. Let's just call him Chip. Chip doesn't work as hard or create as much wealth as Rajiv in Bangalore, who gets up early every morning and heads off to put in a full shift making the latest electronic gizmo from Apple that Chip loves. But Chip assumes he will always live better than Rajiv simply because he's Canadian, he's North American, and Rajiv in Bangalore isn't. And Chip would revile the comparison, but his assumptions are no different from Cecil Rhodes, who said in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, that to be born an Englishman was to win first prize in the lottery of life. And it was true once, and because it was once true, people assume it will always be true. But Chip is wrong in his complacency. An advanced, developed society is a rare and precious thing and has to be earned. And if all the Rajivs in Bangalore at the Apple factory work harder than all the Chips in Ottawa entering their 2nd decade of human rights studies, then eventually economic reality will assert itself. And that is the second fact of life, that permanence is the illusion of every age. Everybody has thought, everybody from the Roman Empire to the British Empire has thought that what they had was permanent, and they had put themselves beyond the winds of history, and they have not. Another fact of life, you don't need a president for life if you've got a bureaucracy for life. The dictatorships in Africa and Latin America specialized in presidents for life. And they would seize the presidential palace, and they were there for at least a week and a half until they were carried out by the handles and the new president for life took over. The Western world has found a different way, which is the bureaucracy for life. And I think that is a threat to liberty and a threat to representative government. You see it in Europe, you see it in the United States. California is broke. California's economy California has a population about the size of Canada's. It has a state government that, like many others in North America, is essentially a malign, self-dealing alliance between the political elite, the unionized bureaucracy, and a permanent dependency class. The California Occupational Safety and Health Standards Board has been trying to decide whether the pornographic movie industry should be subject to the same regulatory regime and hygiene procedures as hospitals, you know, with the surgical masks and the latex gloves, which would, I think, I'm not a connoisseur of pornography, but I think would look kind of odd in most of the admittedly rather underdeveloped plots that those movies hold them together. But anyway, they want the porn movie industry to be brought subject to the same health and hygiene regime as hospitals. Actually, for any Quebecers here, if you've ever been in one of those Quebec hospitals with the distinctive strain of C. difficile that La Belle Province has managed to develop, you'll know it would make a lot more sense to require Quebec hospitals to bring themselves up to the same hygiene standards as a San Fernando Valley pornographic movie shoot. There is no, the regulatory state, also in California, they're considering making it illegal to have non-fitted sheets in motels and hotel beds. So it would be illegal. They're setting up a sheet regulatory authority to ensure that there are no non-fitted sheets on bed. Unionized bureaucrats with gold-plated benefits and pensions would make a living from checking they've got elasticated sheets at the Westin next door. And so you will have a sheet regulatory regime with sheet regulatory enforcers kicking down the door of room 73 of the Econo Lodge to check you're in compliance. You can try to resist, but they'll kick the sheet out of you. You know, when this country decriminalized homosexuality, and this is the fascinating thing about progressive government, when this country decriminalized homosexuality, Pierre Trudeau famously said, "The state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation." But in fact, big government, like the California Sheet Police, says, "Oh, yes, we do," if you're consummating your same-sex marriage on a non-fitted sheet. It's not good for business, you know. I was talking to a Ku Klux Klan guy, and they were going to hold the big national convention in San Diego, but then they said every Grand Kleagle would have to have an elasticated sheet, and it, you know, it makes your redneck too red. It's, you know, it's not just about redistributing wealth or even redistributing liberty. It's something more basic than that. Basically, it's redistributing societal energy from the productive sector to the obstructive sector. And that is another fact of life, that big government makes small citizens. To be told you are not free to put a non-elasticated sheet on your bed is not a small loss. It's immense and profound in what it says about state power. And that is true for the people who regulate our lives, too. I was on the receiving end, not, as Rick said, of just the Ontario Human Rights Commission, but of 3 separate human rights commissions in this country. Where do you go to vote out the HRC? Which polling station do you go to vote out whichever faceless bureaucrat at the RCMP banned that gun the other day? The left loves this stuff because it makes elections less and less important. You have, in a sense, a permanent one-party bureaucratic state in which occasionally a left-wing party will get knocked out of power, but the right-wing party that comes in is basically sitting in the pilot seat of a plane locked on the bureaucracy's automatic pilot. In English boys' boarding schools, the prefects used to give the boys in the first year tuppence halfpenny in those chilly, wintry, unheated schools to go and sit on the toilets and keep the seat warm until the prefect was ready to swan in and assume his rightful position. And the Liberal Party of Canada and other left-of-centre parties around the world understand that that is the basic function of right-of-centre parties when the Liberals are knocked out of office. You give the Conservatives tuppence halfpenny to go in and keep the seat of the one-party bureaucratic toilet warm until the left-of-centre party is ready to resume its place again. And it requires tremendous determination to do what Jason Kenney and other cabinet ministers have done over the last few years, to take meaningful, democratic, accountable control of even a tiny part of the permanent hydra-headed bureaucracy. And as difficult as it is, yes. You know, I don't know how many of his civil servants genuinely like Jason Kenney, but they understand that it's not business as usual. And it takes tremendous forcefulness to actually take one of those departments and persuade it to rethink its, because they think, Jason Kenney, yeah, he'll be here 2, 3, 4 years, then he's gone and some other guy. We'll carry on regardless. And it takes tremendous determination to ensure that they don't carry on regardless. And the left is thinking about that permanent bureaucracy the whole time, not just at City Hall, County Hall, Provincial Hall, Dominion Hall, but United Nations Hall. They're thinking of it at a global level. Anyone here know who Herman Van Rompuy is? Oh, wow. Yes, you, sir. Yeah, that's right, that's right. You win the Honda Civic. Have a word with Preston. It's fully loaded and it'll be waiting for you outside. Yeah, he's some Belgian bloke who managed to get himself appointed, quote, President of Europe, whatever that means. He's hardly a household name, even in the Van Rompuy household. I don't think Belgian TV has Belgian Idol or Dancing with the Belgians, but he'd be knocked out in round one, I think, even if but in his acceptance speech, you know, so he's like, he basically got lucky. One minute he was an obscure Belgian, next minute he was an obscure Belgian with President of Europe printing it on his business card. You know, it could happen to anyone. But he declared, in his acceptance speech, he declared 2009 is the first year of global governance. Did you get that memo? You know, if you don't like your local school, you can move to the next town. If you're sick of Quebec taxes, you can move to Saskatchewan. Where do you move to if you don't like global governance? What polling station do you go to vote that out? So the rise of the hyper-regulatory bureaucratic state is an assault on representative government, and free peoples have to figure out a way to reclaim the right to change their government so that that faceless bureaucrat in the RCMP and all the other regulatory agencies is implementing the will of the people's representatives and not, in effect, passing new micro-laws without the tedious business of having to bring them to Parliament. I would say another fact of life, the most consequential act of state ownership in the late 20th century Western world was not the nationalization of airlines or the nationalization of railways or the nationalization of healthcare, but the nationalization of the family. I owe that phrase to Professor Vaidyanathan at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, which town I mentioned a few minutes ago. And he's a bit of a chippy post-imperialist, and he's nobody's idea of a right-winger, but he's absolutely right about this. It's the defining idea of our times. Once upon a time, ambitious leftists wanted to take control of the controlling heights of the economy. Steel, coal, cars, planes, banks, but it was such a disaster that it's been more or less abandoned. And instead, they did something which I think is far subtler, which is to embark on the nationalization of the family. The West has nationalized families over the last 60 years, writes Professor Vaidyanathan. Old age, ill health, single motherhood, everything is the responsibility of the state. And like any other nationalized industry, the nationalized family prioritizes more and more perks for its beneficiaries, it's unresponsive to market pressure, and it revels in declining productivity. Literally, I mean, the biggest structural defect, which again has been tangentially touched on here, the biggest structural defect in the Western world is its deathbed demography, the upside-down family tree. In Greece, 4 grandparents of 2 children have 1 grandchild. So the problem in Greece isn't fiscal, It's not an accounting issue. It's not a budget issue. It's way beyond that. Is it likely that 42 grandchildren are going to pay off the debts run up by 100 grandparents? Everybody knows the answer to that. The nationalized family doesn't save. Canada, for example, I said it had significantly lower levels of government debt than many other countries, but it has unhealthy levels of personal debt. Why should the nationalized family save? When the state pays for your retirement and your kids and your aged parents and your health care, what's to save for? You know, Edmund Burke talked about the little platoons. I've heard it quoted a couple of times at panels around here the last couple of days. And Alexis de Tocqueville put it slightly differently, that what matters are the mediating institutions between the citizen and the sovereign, local government, churches, charities, civic institutions, too many of which have been hacked away over the last 2 or 3 generations. But the most basic societal building block of all is the family. And another fact of life to that is that the great evil of welfare is not that it's a waste of money, but that it's a waste of people. When you have transgenerational, multi-generational welfare, when you have families where people don't work, where nobody has any memories of people working, and that goes on to 2, 3, 4 generations, that's the most appalling waste of people's lives. And that waste of lives is far more critical and a far worse evil than simply the waste of money involved. And I would say, as a final thought, that this is the most important fact of all. Culture trumps politics. Once every few years, you can persuade the electorate to go out and vote for a Conservative party. But if you want them to vote for Conservative government, you have to do the hard work of shifting the culture every day, 7 days a week, in all the years between elections. Because if the culture's liberal, if the schools are liberal, if the churches are liberal, if the hip, fashionable business elite is liberal, if the guys who make the movies and the pop songs are liberal, then electing a Conservative ministry isn't going to make a lot of difference. And nor should it, because in a free society, politics is the art of the possible. And if you want to make more things possible, you need to lay all the groundwork in the period between elections. Susan Delacourt said just before I came on, about an hour ago, that the thing about the Conservative Party is that by the time the election campaign is launched, they've already fought the election campaign. In other words, they've done it before the campaign officially begins. And that's another line of Mrs. Thatcher's. First you win the argument, then you win the election. But you don't think about it just in terms of what you need to move the meter this way in this or that swing riding. You need, in terms of what you're able to do in government, in terms of making sure that you're not merely in office, but in power and able to affect change, you have to be able to do that work in a more profound sense. Winning the election is one day. Winning the argument is every day. You know, when I ran into trouble with the Human Rights Commissions 5 years ago, I had lunch with an old friend in Montreal who said, just stay quiet, keep your head down, it'll all blow over. And if I'd taken his advice, I would have lost. Maclean's would have lost. Canada's left-wing media, though they wouldn't thank me for it, would have lost basic free press rights. And Canadian citizens, all of you, would have lost basic free speech rights. And then I ran into that well-known nutter, Ezra Levant, who said, no, you need to go nuclear. And by the way, that's Ezra's advice for everything. If you ever get a parking ticket or the line at Tim Hortons is moving slowly, that's always it. Just go nuclear. So we did go nuclear because the Human Rights Commission had erected a speech regulation regime at odds with Canada's entire 8 centuries of legal inheritance. So Ezra and I decided to go Magna Carta on the Human Rights Commission's medieval ass. And You know, and it was exhausting, but we gave them the worst 2 years publicity in their history. And by the end of it, the Toronto Star and Penn Canada, that's Margaret Atwood and all the gang, were all on board with restoring free speech. And finally, the political class got on board. And after a somewhat tortured path through the Senate, last summer, a private member's bill received royal assent, and Section 13, Canada's disgusting censorship law, was finally abolished. No. Don't do that, because the great lesson of that was just, for me as someone who has never fought a political campaign, never tried to get a bill through Parliament, the great lesson of that was that it took Ezra and me and a few others going bananas just to drag the great squishy center of conventional wisdom 1/2 inch in the direction of sanity. And the lesson you should learn from that is the great thing about being conservative, as opposed to being a left-winger who just wants to be in power and just wants the party to be in office. We're always dissatisfied. And we're right to be dissatisfied with our party, because it's never going to be enough. Because the lesson of that is the effort involved just in moving the meter one little tick on one tiny little issue. But that is how you have to do it in free societies. And you can't do it unless you're out there making the case in all the places where real people lead real lives. You know, the left say they want to save the planet. And the planet's fine. The planet will do okay. The planet will shrug us all off with nary a thought. You know, why not try saving your province? Try saving your county, saving your town, saving your school board. It's not as glamorous, but you might actually have a sporting chance of pulling it off. Nobody needs you to save the planet. And that is where the battle is fought. You know, conservatism is not a pinched, negative, cramped philosophy. We don't believe in big government. We don't believe in big bureaucracy, big regulatory enforcement. But we do believe in big freedoms, in big possibilities, in the biggest, richest civilizational inheritance in this planet's history. One that's delivered longer, better, healthier, more prosperous lives to more people around the world than any other system. One that enables people to live their lives to their fullest potential, to live in liberty, to live in dignity, and to live without fear. And that's not a negative message, and it doesn't need to be pinched to the citizenry in a cramped, negative way. Don't let the liberals, now they've got the guy with great hair. Now they've got rid of Michael Ignatieff, the postmodern guy who, if he ever needed a home, this would certainly be high up on his list. Just because they found a guy with terrific hair, don't let them resurrect that tired old line that somehow Canadian values are liberal values. You know, I love this country. I am grateful to be heir to those 8 centuries of individual liberty. I am proud that Canada was one of the few countries that was on the right side of all 3 of the great global conflicts of the 20th century. I am proud that we have had almost half a century of continuous constitutional evolution without revolutions and presidents for life and dictatorships and all the rest. You go back to the 70s. People think of the 70s in Canada, they think of disco and wide trousers and the Partridge Family. In the 70s, in Spain, Portugal, Greece, Poland, East Germany, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, the 1970s doesn't mean disco. It doesn't mean sometimes when we touch that the ministers of the crown were singing to each other in the... It means dictatorship. That's how rare it is on this planet. And I am proud that this country is one of the handful that has never had to undergo that. And I have utter contempt for those who modify Cromwell's injunction to paint him warts and all by teaching our children only the warts of pre-Trudeaupian Canada. Culture trumps politics, and Conservatives need to get back in the game, in the culture, from the schoolhouse to the movie theatre to all the places where people who aren't interested in politics live and form their impressions of how they vote. And if you get that right, then the politics will follow. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I'm told we've got time for a couple of questions or a rendition of Sometimes When We Touch. So, but if you'd like to ask a question, I'd be honoured to take it. Oh my lord! Yeah, I'm being sued. I'm being sued by Michael Mann, the climate change guy, for mocking his hockey stick. This is the one that shows the last 1,000 years, completely flat temperature, and then just like the hockey blade on going straight up through the 20th century. And I don't really, care. The scale of lawsuits in the United States. This is in D.C. Superior Court. Is so different. Ezra rang me up the other day. He said things had gone badly for him in an Ontario court, and it had cost him $7,500. And I said, yeah, cry me a river. The first year and a half of pointless litigation with this guy in Washington had cost $500,000. So the lesson there, I think, is again, don't let people set the parameters of the debates. Don't let people co-opt the language and make it easy to portray you as deniers on that. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi there, sir. I'm a conservative, so I believe, Western civilization was a good thing. But, every now and again in kind of Western history, we've done things that haven't been great. And how do we talk about those as conservatives while saying that, our underlying values we believe in, Western civilization is good, but, some things that we've done in our history haven't always been great.
Well, I think you acknowledge them honestly, but you don't distort the record. And the record is that that principles of liberty derive from a relatively narrow tradition around the world. And I'm not being Eurocentric in this particular instance, because continental countries have proved absolutely hopeless for the most part at reliably transferring them on from one generation to another. I forget what is the French, what republic of the French up to by now? Are they, they've had their second empires and third republic, fifth republic, I think they're at. It's the old Punch joke about the guy walks into the library and says, where can I find a copy of the French Constitution? And the librarian said, it's filed under periodicals. But we have our tradition. I mocked Mikhail Jean delivering the throne speech from Senator Brazeau's new place of employment. But all the things, when we criticize the Senate and people say, well, I don't see, why do we need a lieutenant governor in every province? When they're actually mocking a system that has been around so long, it has developed bits we find quaint and obsolescent and funny and like to laugh at and mock and sneer at. Do you know what a luxury that is in the world? That your system of government sticks around long enough for it to seem quaint and obsolete and cobwebbed. That is actually one of the great qualities of it. And the other thing I would say on that, which I absolutely reject, is the urge to somehow. There are millions of people around the world who know what it's like to fear the 3 a.m. knock on the door, who know what it's like to have the door kicked in, who know what it's like. Many people came to Canada because they know what it's like to be walking on a carpet with no floorboards underneath, that somehow civilization is conditional, which is what it was in Eastern Europe and many other places where people came here. And so when I hear people like Bernie Farber, who is a member of he ran as a Liberal candidate somewhere in Toronto, I forget which riding it was. Yeah, Thornhill. When I hear him try to get Canada made guilty of genocide for the way it treated its First Nations of people, there are millions of people, including Bernie Farber, who's apparently forgotten, who know what real genocide is. And it's absolutely disgusting that people have so little sense of proportion that they'd in effect attempt to move Canada into the same camp as some of the most evil regimes in history. And by the way, you know, Bernie Farber on his Twitter feed has the picture of him getting the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, you know, which Ezra and I are not in any danger of being nominated for anytime soon. But I'll tell you something, if I ever was offered a Diamond Jubilee Medal, I wouldn't take it from a regime that's supposedly guilty of genocide. I don't get that. We have to learn, we have to be honest, and we have to maintain a sense of proportion about these things. Yes, you, sir.
You mentioned the eight-year human rights student, and at the University of Ottawa, we currently have a student union president who I think is in her 10th year for women's studies degree, and I'm just wondering what your advice would be to conservatives on university campuses across the country that have to deal with left-wing extremism in our student unions.
I think you should always listen carefully when someone is telling you to shut up, and you should. I have a degree of tolerance for all kinds of view. My friend and colleague Paul Wells was speaking earlier. Paul bashed me and mocked me and sneered at me and jeered at me in some big Maclean's call. I think that's fine. I disagree with Paul. I don't want to ban Paul. And the minute I was to say, well, I think Paul Wells should be banned, I would hope that Paul Wells would punch me in the kisser. Because if you're not allowed to discuss these things, then the only thing that's left is physical violence. You know, the pen is only mightier than the sword if you're allowed to use the pen. And at your university and at Kingston and at too many seats of institutions that are supposed to be open to honest inquiry, too many people say, no, you can't use the pen. And the minute free speech is not about drawing a line. I mean, that's what I had at the start of this thing. So, it's about where you draw the line. It's about balancing. It all sounds very Canadian. Oh, of course I'm in favor of free speech, but it's about where you draw the line. No, it's not. It's very easy. Free speech is for all the stuff you think should be on the other side of the line. It's for all the stuff you find offensive. It's for all the stuff you find grotesque. And that guy, who's the guy at Carleton who was basically the next Prime Minister in waiting for 20 minutes back in the 1990s when Chrétien had his Crown Prince of the Week thing going on? What was that guy? Which guy was it? Alan Rock. When he said, when he writes a letter to Ann Coulter before she comes to his university and says, you're not in America now. You've got to be careful about what you say. This is all it's very different. He ought to be ashamed of himself as a so-called liberal. So when a Prime Minister in waiting circa 1997, like Alan Rock, tells you that, you say to him, do you want to step outside? Because when he tells you you can't say anything, then saying do you want to step outside is the only alternative. Thank you very much. I'll take one more question because we have to.
Do I go?
Yeah, you.
Hello, Mr. Steyn. Steyn. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good, thanks.
That was my question, thank you. No, I'm
That's
just
it.
kidding. So, you emphasized that there has to be a greater focus on like the local community,
Right.
which I actually greatly agree, because everyone's always focusing on what's going around and they forget about what's like directly beside them. So, in our globalized economy and just like in the world and how it's going, how can you focus on, like, what's your strategy for like focusing on like the community that's close and trying to, you know, deal with the globalized world as well?
Well, I don't think you abandon one or the other, but the thing is, you can do it at the local level. You can get it done. You know, it actually, in my town in New Hampshire, a couple of towns over, a guy wanted to put a bridge was washed out, and they wanted to put up a new bridge. And somebody came through and said, well, you know, there's a new state bridge grant program where it's, I think it was the 70-30 plan. You'd have to pay 30% of it, the state would pay 70%. And so they went in for that plan, and for 5 years the bridge wasn't built. And at that point, Obama introduced his stimulus, which meant that there was now an 80-20 federal-state bridge building program. So the town would be paying 30% of the state's 20%, and the feds would pay the rest of the bridge. So another 4 years went by, and the bridge still wasn't built, and the temporary bridge wore out. And just before, you know, Ban Ki-moon came in and said, well, wait until the UN 60-40 bridge, another bridge wore out, and instead of going in for the 70-30 state, local, 80-20 federal, state, 60-40 UN federal, they just put up a bridge themselves for $16,000. And believe it or not, you know, the first people who came to this continent did that all over the map. It wasn't regarded as a great achievement. They hacked their way into the wilderness, and they built towns, and they cleared land, and they built farms, and they built grist mills next to streams, and they built communities. And that's how you do it. Nobody gives you that little village or that little town. Those people hacked their way into the woods, and they built it themselves, and that's still the best advice. Thank you very much indeed.